How does linguistic privilege and marginalization impact scholarly communication? So that's a little bit of the general frame of what we've been doing. And here we go. Okay, so for this community, I don't really need to spend a lot of time on the context. I think you all are probably aware and have lived experience of the fact that English has occupied a sort of privileged or central position in the scholarly communication network over the past few decades. And that while there are some there's some logic to choosing a single language for scholarly communication, but the cracks of a single language system are starting to show. It at the moment is English. In the past, other languages have occupied that central position, but the idea that one language should be sort of the single choice has led to a number of inequities. So we've seen examples. Tatsuya Amano and his team earlier this year published a really wonderful paper called The Manifold Costs of Being a Non-Native Speaker. And they've produced some empirical evidence showing that it takes more time and more effort for non-Anglophones to read, to publish, to present in English. We know that when you choose one language, it sort of excludes some people from the conversation. So these challenges are becoming more and more evident. And at the same time, we're seeing more advocacy for reverting to a system that is more multilingual, that has multiple language options. So we've seen the Helsinki Initiative coming up on their 5-year anniversary now, have been advocating for multilingual scholarly communication. UNESCO, in their recommendation for open science, actually posited language as one facet of being open. For science to be open, it needs to be open to other languages beyond English. So there's increased advocacy in this area for multilingualism. And so our objective was to see, well, the flip side, so the problems with a single language model are obvious, but the flip side is not necessarily straightforward either. If we want to have a multilingual system, it creates a challenge. How do we access, discover, read, engage with the work of people who are writing in a language that we don't understand? So if we want multilingualism, we need some kind of solution for that. How can we, kind of access work in other languages? And of course, over the past sort of 5-10 years, we've also seen, alongside an interest in multilingualism or an advocacy for multilingualism, we've seen an interest in exploring the potential of translation tools. So tools like Google Translate, or more recently, ChatGPT, these kind of AI-based tools that have the potential to generate automatic translations. So our question for our systematic review project was to look at the extent to which these tools are being used. Like, are they being used? How are they being used? Are they useful for scholarly communication specifically? So that's the focus that we took. And more specifically, our objectives. We had one overarching question, and that was, how are translation technologies being used for multilingual scholarly communication in Canada, because the funder was Canadian, but also beyond, because we're interested in lessons learned potentially from other parts of the world. And more specifically, we wanted to know to what extent they're being used. Are they widely used? Are they not widely used? Are only specific sub-communities engaging with these tools? What purposes within scholarly communication are they being applied to? Because even scholarly communication has multiple potential use cases, right? We could imagine using these tools for discovery. We could imagine using them for reading work in a language that we don't understand. We can imagine using them as a writing aid to help us produce a text in another language. So which of these use cases are kind of active within scholarly communication? And then we also wanted to have a few details about the specifics. Which particular tools seem to be popular? or not? Which languages are kind of in the frame? Are these tools being used with every language imaginable or just a small set of languages? And also, what types of texts within scholarly communication are being translated with the help of these tools? So those are our more specific questions. I will turn the floor over to Phillips now, who's going to walk us through the methods section.
All right, thank you so much. So we employed the systematic review. As you know, this is a systematic review project, and systematic review, as we all know, has the potential to produce reliable knowledge in a systematic and reproducible way. Unlike, maybe traditional review, which, maybe a state-of-the-art review, but this is so specific because it has a specific approach that has to be taken, right? So, and this really helped us to be able to produce this report, and which, if anyone is interested, can look at the full report and probably follow through the process. So in order for us to get this done, we have inclusion criteria and some exclusion criteria. So we included studies that focused on three areas. So the first is automatic translation, which, for instance, is machine translation tools such as Google Translate, DeepL, or Microsoft Translator. And the second criteria is if they focus on scholarly communication context, specifically about scholarly communication, not other contexts, such as maybe when how physicians use translation tools to communicate with their patients, but we're really focused about how these tools have been used in scholarly communication context. And the third criteria is the application and the use of these translation tools by and for scholars, um, and not the development of a tool for more general purpose translation, but if these tools have been applied and used by scholars. So these are the three inclusion criteria that we employ to include these studies. So studies that did not fall between these three focus on these criteria were excluded from the study. Next slide, please. Okay, so in order for us to be able to search for these relevant articles, we developed a search query, which we applied in 9 bibliography databases. And so uh, the the reason why we ensure that we had a broad coverage of databases was to ensure that no relevant article were missed. So for instance, we searched in Scopus and Web of Science core collections, and ERIC, Dimensions, Erudite. So we have we have some databases focused on specific content. For instance, Erudite is more French content. We also searched Redalyc, which is more Spanish content. So this really helped us to be able to search for all relevant articles, in our own, as much as possible. So we conducted the search in 4 languages, in English, in French, in Spanish, and Polish. And as we are aware, most of the systematic reviews out there, they usually report a limitation of conducting the search in only English, right? So they exclude every other article that is not published in English. But in our case, we conducted in 4 languages, but we also included studies that have, we also included studies that have been published in other languages, and we used the machine translation tools to translate them in order for us to carry out full text screening. So this really helped us to abort the limitation of language barrier in including relevant articles. So for instance, some items also have multilingual metadata. For instance, a Portuguese article with an abstract in Spanish. So with our with 4 languages that we use, we're able to really ensure that we included more relevant articles as much as possible. The next slide, please. So our search strategy focused on 2 concepts. The first relates to translation tools or machine translation, and the second relates to scholarly communication. So we listed out terms related to this concept that have been used in literature, and also based on understanding of the field. For instance, the expertise from Lynne in translation tools, and Emmanuel and I in scholarly communication. And so we've been able to develop this search concept, and we employed Boolean operators or to look for one of the items, either of the items in the database, and we combine this concept with Boolean operator hand. I'm sure that you're not oblivious to this strategy, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. The next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of records, we retrieved a total of 875 items published between January 2017 and September 2023. So from 8 databases, we retrieved 860 items, and we also conducted additional search in Google Scholar because we understand that some articles may not be available in proprietary databases. And so we were able to retrieve 15 potentially relevant articles from Google Scholar. And so we, after conducting title and abstract screening, we excluded 606 articles because they are not relevant to the focus of our study. And we conducted full test screening of 160 articles, from which we excluded 120 articles because, for instance, 91 articles focus on the use of machine translation for other purposes and not for scholarly communication. And so we have other reasons, and we make sure to document all the reasons why we excluded the full text articles. And we included 40 articles for qualitative analysis. Next slide. Okay, so in terms of data extraction, we developed a coding scheme which we used and we applied to code the studies, the included studies in vivo software. So this coding scheme was later refined to accurately reflect the findings of the study because some findings, some things did not fit within the pre-developed scheme. So we refined the coding scheme to capture all the relevant findings from the study. And so the coded data was synthesized qualitatively. So the data analysis was conducted qualitatively. So to synthesize existing knowledge and to look for a gap, and which also led to recommendations for future studies. And so from our qualitative analysis, we developed, systems emerged from the analysis. And the figure here is a word cloud, which we conducted to gain an initial insight into the kind of data, to the words, and to the content of the data. And you can see that translators as is most frequently used words followed by English. And this word cloud, the word cloud highlights the prominence of English in scholarly communication. So English appears more than 4 times as often as the next most frequent mentioned language, Chinese. So English has show that it's more prominent in how scholars have been researching this concept and from the included studies. The next slide. So the results, so I'm going to talk about study characteristics while Lynne will continue to talk about the main findings from the study. So in terms of the countries of publication, for 5 studies were based in Japan, 3 studies each in Canada, China, Taiwan, UK, and US. And so while English-speaking countries such as the UK and USA are represented, there is a greater volume of research on this topic taking place in countries where English is not the only national language. And what's the implication? The implication is that researchers from nations that are not exclusively Anglophone are motivated to find ways of facilitating multilingualism in scholarly communication. And that's why you can see that studies such as countries such as Japan have more studies because they are looking for ways to ensure multilingualism in their scholarly communication practices. So in terms of methods, 32 studies use experiments for testing and evaluating the quality of machine translation tools. And for publication types, 21 or slightly above average of the included studies published as journal articles, followed by those published by as conference papers. And other studies include book chapters and workshop reports. Over to you, Lynne.
Thank you, Phillips. Okay, so to dive a little more deeply into some of the specific results, We discovered that the most commonly used type of translation technology is a tool that uses a neural approach, so neural machine translation systems. These appeared in late 2016, and they really effectively, in a very short period of time, replaced the previous architecture, which was statistical machine translation. So neural machine translation is now the most common type. It's what you would use if you use a tool like Google Translate, for example. And so neural machine translation is the most common. And of the neural machine translation tools that are available, Google Translate was the one most often used by participants in the studies that we retained for our investigation. Of course, the reasons are not mysterious. This is a freely available tool. It's easy to access online. It's easy to use. And Google in particular is available in a comparatively wide range of languages, over 130 now, as compared to other neural machine translation tools. DeepL is available in about 30 languages. So Google has many more languages, although the quality is not even across all of them. You might be asking yourselves, was anyone interested in large language models? Because, of course, these stampeded onto the scene in late 2022. We had ChatGPT, of course, being one of the best known examples. And because of publication lag, really, I think is the answer here. We did see a couple of people already starting to investigate large language models, but because we had to close off our searching by September, and because sometimes publications take more than a year to actually reach the final availability stage, we didn't see as many as we might have expected. There's certainly, in my opinion, anecdotally, a lot of interest in these large language models. But I think if we had been able to extend our study, another few months, we would have seen more. So there's an emerging interest, but it's certainly not well represented in the period in which we investigated. Interesting to note some gaps. So people are not, at least from a research perspective, not really active in combining machine translation technologies with other types of language processing tools. So we know that scholarly communication has a publishing side, obviously, but there's also, the type of scholarly communication that's happening right now, where people talk to each other, give a presentation. And so I was a little bit surprised not to see any evidence of people researching the possibility of combining machine translation with speech technologies or with subtitling tools, which I think actually do hold a lot of potential for multilingual conferences or interviews or other types of spoken language or multimodal communication. So this is a gap, points to an area that could be interesting for people who want looking for a research subject. I think that would be a fun thing to investigate. In terms of the languages that are being used, we retained 40 studies for our investigation, and we found that English was one part of the language pair in every single one of those 40 studies. So English really still is occupying a very central space in scholarly communication. And even more interesting, in 25 of the 40 studies, English was the target language, which means people were translating out of another language and into English. So if we think about, the potential of machine translation for supporting a multilingual scholarly communication system, what we actually see in the evidence is that the tools are being used still to kind of prop up English, right? People are still using them to translate into English and not out of English or not between two other languages. And so we're not seeing as strong as evidence as we might expect that the tools are displacing English from the center. What we're seeing instead is that people who are not native speakers of English are using these tools to reduce their own maybe cognitive burden, time pressure, cost. People are using the tools to help them write in English more quickly, more cheaply, more easily. But it's still the majority of the work is going into English, which is perhaps a bit disappointing, but that's what the results are showing us. Because this was a study funded by SSHRC, they were also very interested to know how is French and how are Canadian Indigenous languages coming out in your research? And the answer is there's not a lot of activity there. French was included in 8 of the studies, so just 20%, and there were no studies at all focusing on Indigenous languages of Canada or even of the Americas. In terms of the other languages in general, what I can observe is that relatively few of them, so just a quarter, are what we would describe as less widely used languages or low resource languages. And this is important when you talk about machine translation. These neural machine translation tools or large language models like ChatGPT are data-driven models. And that means that in order for them to work effectively, you need millions and preferably billions of examples. And this is difficult to achieve in some of the less widely used languages, and especially if you're dealing with specialized domains. It's quite easy to put together a parallel corpus of previously translated texts between major languages like English and French. But when you are dealing with an indigenous language or a language of lesser diffusion, maybe a language like Greek or Danish, where there are relatively few speakers, the quality of the tool is often dramatically reduced because the number of examples or the size of the corpus, the resources available, is much smaller. And so there's a noticeable difference when you have a small corpus for the quality of the translation. So this could explain why there are, well, why even Google, which has 130 languages, I mean, the world has 7,000 languages. So we're just covering a smidgen of the number of languages out there. And people may not be using them with less widely used languages because the quality is much poorer. So this, I think, is something that's worth taking note, because what we may find is that instead of bridging the digital divide, we may find that these technologies actually exacerbate it. They could push a language that's already at the periphery even further to the margins because, the tools are being developed and actively used for languages that are already well supported, and they're not being actively developed or actively used for languages that don't have support already. So this is something for us to keep an eye on. With regard to the text types, we are seeing that 13 of the studies were looking at how machine translation could be used to produce written texts like articles or papers. A few had systems that were prototype systems developed specifically with the intent of translating scholarly texts. So the corpus that was used to train the machine learning systems were scholarly texts. But of course, they have to be texts that people can get a hold of and that they have permission to put in their corpus. And so many of them used only abstracts because those are often available easily, not behind a paywall like the full text, or theses or dissertations, because these are often available in institutional repositories. So we see that the corpora that are being used are not necessarily representative of the entire range of texts that people need to manipulate for scholarly communication. And particularly interesting to me were gaps such as, texts like posters or slides or plain language summaries don't seem to be well represented in the studies that are investigating the use of machine translation. And this is important because a text like a poster or a PowerPoint presentation has particular characteristics and ones that I instinctively feel that as a translator will be challenging for machine translation. We know that slides often use point form. They don't have complete sentences. And this makes it perhaps a bit challenging for the systems to process these texts correctly. So I think there's definitely, again, a big gap here and scope for investigating how these tools will process a wider variety of texts that are used within scholarly communication. And of course, the multimodality as well. How are people kind of using subtitling features for conferences or online presentations? And how how is the quality of the multimodal translation that's being used, such as subtitles, for example? Okay. In terms of people reporting on their experience of using tools, there was, I would say, a reasonable degree of machine translation literacy among some of the authors. Most of them were aware that you shouldn't just take the raw, unedited output and try to publish it. That you would need to do some work on it yourself, something that's called post-editing, so kind of fixing up and improving the output of a machine translation system. There was also a recognition that you can improve the output by improving the input. And so some people were talking about trying to simplify their input text or pre-edit, pre-process their input text in order to get better quality results. But one thing that I did notice was that some of the research that's being done, so this is research about the use of machine translation for scholarly communication, is being done by people who have a background neither in translation nor in information science. So it could be like a group of medical researchers experimenting with machine translation to see how it can be used in their field. And because of that, perhaps like different background, I found that some of their assumptions that they made about machine translation tools were perhaps a bit naive. And it's really interesting to me that people would approach a research topic in which they don't have a strong background. It would be like me, for example, doing research in, I don't know, chemistry or something. I don't have a background in chemistry, and so I wouldn't necessarily make smart or informed kind of observations about it. And I did find that a little bit. Some people were having a naive understanding of machine translation. So again, just I'm not sure what to do with it, but it's an interesting observation that I made. Um, and then we wanted to try and see how the information that we found could potentially be used moving forward. So we were trying to consider some of the policy implications of what we have discovered in our research. We do believe there's an appetite for publishing in languages beyond English. English is still quite central, but there's interest, obviously, in other languages. And so that is encouraging. But we think that there needs to be more support for, kind of valuing work in other languages. So I'll come back to this point again, but I just kind of keep in your mind that sort of like technology is not enough. We think that there's probably a need for some guidelines or even policies about the responsible and transparent use of tools in scholarly communication. When ChatGPT kind of first erupted, there were some journal editors that had a very sort of knee-jerk reaction against the use of generative AI and came out with bans, like nobody who uses any form of generative AI tool to produce their paper can publish in our journal. They were very categorical, no use of generative AI. And I think their motivation was to try and prevent the AI tools being used to generate content, because we know there are problems with the truthfulness or the accuracy of what some of these generative AI tools will produce, the hallucinations and just misinformation. So I think that the reaction of the editors was to try and prevent that, which makes a lot of sense. We don't want AI generated content. But I think they did not take into consideration the fact that these tools can be used not to generate content, but to kind of improve the linguistic quality, or to kind of, use it almost like an augmented grammar checker in a way, right? The style and grammar checker tools are perfectly permitted by these journals, and they didn't sort of see generative AI's potential in that capacity. So again, I think we maybe need more nuance in understanding these tools and not just blanket banning them outright. We saw in our research that all of the responsibility for translation seems to still be placed on the shoulders of the same people. So we are still mostly seeing translation into English with an intent to publish in English. So the potential of these tools for helping people access information in other languages is not being realized fully. There's mostly, I say that the non-Anglophone scholars are using it to reduce the amount of effort needed to publish in English, but still with the goal always of publishing in English. So this is still like a one-sided use of this technology. We also think that it's important, as I mentioned, to recognize that for the tools to work well, you need a huge volume of data. So potentially, open access policies have something to contribute here. If we had access to more data in other languages, the quality of the tools would be better. And so I think moving forward, it will be interesting to see. I'm already seeing in the literature people talking about the value of domain-specific language models. So rather than going for these very, very large general purpose tools like ChatGPT, which is a multi-purpose tool, it can do lots of different things, we may see more kind of small language models that are more specialized, that would make more sense for specialized communication and also would make more sense for languages that are less widely used. So, you know, if we have data from open access, we can potentially actually design useful models for scholarly communication, and that could help. And as I mentioned in a couple of different places, there's not been a lot of attention yet paid from a research perspective anyway, to how these machine translation tools can be combined with speech technologies in the context of scholarly communication. So there's work to be done there. And to conclude, we can see that translation tools created for general purposes may not be sufficient for translating specialized scholarly content well. This could also be one reason why we're not seeing as many as we might expect. We know that the tools are not perfect, so it's important to not rely solely on technology, but to recognize that people also need to be smart users of the tools, need to be responsible users of the tools. We see that there are implications at the moment for just supporting English in a different way rather than decentering English a little bit. That's not happening as much as we thought we might see. And we're not using the tools for discovery or access, but only for second language writing. And so while technologies can play an important role, you know, that move us closer to the goal of equity and diversity, technology alone won't suffice, right? The tools can already translate in both directions, but they're not being used to translate in both directions. So along with the technology, we need to kind of come up with either policies that will support it or a shift in this sort of underlying value structure, right? We need to motivate people to publish in other languages. The technology can support it, but the technology doesn't provide the motivation when your institution is, you know, encouraging you to publish only in international journals that only publish in English, or when your, you know, your promotion or your tenure application is based on having publications in high impact journals that don't publish in your language. So the technology alone is not a panacea. It won't solve all the problems. It can be part of the solution, but we need to attack the problem from multiple fronts at once. And I think that is it. We have some references there if people are interested. But I should have put the link. Maybe Christian will put it in the chat, or I will put it in the chat, the link to our full report for people who are interested in reading the full report.
I
And those
already have
are
put
contact
it
details.
in the chat.
Oh,
Yeah.
perfect.
So thank you very
Okay.
much, Lynne. Thank you very much, Phillips. And yeah, from the back seat, thank you very much, Emmanuel, as well. Yeah, probably you have a lot of comments and questions, but now the powerful contribution is expected from Alexandra Svatek, who will discuss the results and the paper. So, Ola, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so I actually want to say I have no questions question. Everything is well explained. There's nothing to discuss. Lynn and Philip did a great job. But actually, I wanted to bring up and ask questions and engage Lynne and Philip in a discussion related to the three themes that I see emerging from the results of the study. And maybe the first theme that and questions that I have are related to very practical issues related to machine translation and ChatGPT, and some policy solutions that we could see unfold. And what I mean by that is talking about the quality of data that is needed for both for machine translation and for AI. So as you point out in your paper, there is a big gap between high resource languages and low resource languages. And what we really need to improve the quality of machine translation between these two, or even between two low resource languages, is we need actually parallel corpora, hopefully like domain specific parallel corpora, and parallel corpus is, for those who don't sit in the corpus world, is where you actually have a data set of text in one language and they are translated by humans into another language. So it's very high quality translation, but it requires a lot of labor, a lot of resources, and a lot of time. So, so when we think about some of the issues emerging from, looking at what the quality of machine translation is, a lot of it comes from that low resource languages not really having enough data sets. And so maybe question to Lynne, because you've been working in translation for so long. Have you seen in the past, or over 20 years, a development of or support for developing such data sets, or like financial, like especially in Canada, that would be later, that these data sets could be later used for machine translation? Is there like policy, or is there support for that? Has there been change?
So it's a fantastic question, and it's a really important one. And my global response is yes, we have seen some activity, but not enough. Or the activity that we're seeing in Canada, there's been a lot of activity and a lot of support to develop French language resources, which is wonderful, because French, compared to English in Canada, is the minority situation. But what we're not seeing, for example, is support for the Indigenous languages, which are even more minoritized. So we are seeing improvement, but not even improvement across all the languages. And there are additional challenges with some Indigenous languages in the sense that they have other priorities. For them, machine translation is not their top priority. Some of them can't use their cell phone in their own language because the character map is not there. So they would rather see kind of things that would be helpful in their everyday life. And for them, machine translation is a lower priority. So that's one issue. And another one is that some of these languages have a really strong oral tradition and not a really strong written tradition. And of course, gathering an oral corpus is an order of magnitude even more complicated and more labor intensive than gathering a written corpus. So we're seeing some barriers that are there, additional hurdles that we need to find ways of overcoming. One thing that I will share, though, that I was so excited to see is 2 years ago, 3 years ago, a group of Indigenous scholars submitted an application in their own language. It was a Cree language, to the National Funding Council. And our funding council already feel like they're quite kind of advanced in the sense that they accept applications in both English and French, because it's a national funding council. So they accept applications in both English and French. But these scholars submitted an application in the Cree language, and the funding council just rejected it, like without even kind of reading it, because it wasn't in English or French. And that was a requirement. And these scholars mounted a protest. They really pushed back. And the Funding Council listened. And just 2-3 weeks ago, it went through, it was actually evaluated and it was awarded funding. And this is really encouraging to me. The reason that it took so long, though, was because they actually had to develop an alternate sort of format for evaluation, because of course they needed to have it peer reviewed, like other applications are peer reviewed, and there wasn't a pool of peer reviewers, so they had to go to the community and find people from the community. And the community said, yeah, our language has an oral tradition. We want to evaluate, if you want us to evaluate this, if you want us to help you evaluate this, we want it in an oral format. So they really had to do a lot of rethinking about who can be a peer reviewer, what qualifications you need, what format you want to provide information in. So I think this is the type of surrounding piece that we need. Now, in this case, it wasn't even possible to have machine translation involved, but I like the kind of surrounding piece that this example brings, because it's about rethinking, not expecting that technology will solve everything, that we have to rethink a larger piece. And yes, there might be a role for technology in it, but that alone is not enough. So that's a very long-winded answer and a kind of circular answer to your question, but I do think there's movement, and I do think it's in the right direction. For written texts, I do think open access will be helpful. Like we saw a few systems that have been developed using only abstracts, which have particular textual characteristics. Abstracts have specific features that are not part of a longer text, or that are not, part of every text type. And so we don't want to end up with only abstracts in our corpus, but we understand why that happens, because abstracts are easy to obtain, whereas other texts are hidden behind paywalls.
Yeah, so that actually leads me to this like really good transition into the second kind of key concept that I was thinking as I was reading your paper and as I was listening to you, is the question of ethics really in machine translation, but also in large language models. And so when we think about, for example, ChatGPT, right? And that you're saying that we have a growing use of ChatGPT, and it has been trained on data that hasn't been obtained necessarily using legal means, right? So when we think about machine translation literacy and also encouraging people to be using these tools, what kind of education do we also have to ask them to, participate in terms of be like encouraging just people to use, especially like large language models, because some of the, the way it works, it's not clear like how much it is being trained on the data that you give it, and how much data that actually took was without permission. So I think, that is like an ethical question that I have for you, and maybe for Philip, that I don't know if you could comment on that.
Phillips, do you want to take a run at that?
Okay, yeah. I think in terms of the ethical standpoint, I am not sure how much of discussion we'll have to talk about, because these translation tools are, most of them actually, like you said, rely on data that's been obtained, not necessarily maybe going through necessary permission. But I think in a way it also have a way of helping people to overcome the hurdles of getting their work out there, in other languages, particularly in a language that is very recognized in most publication outlets. So, but I just think that, like Lynne mentioned, there is a need for literacy amongst the users, right? So you don't just put in whatever you want into the machine translation tools. There's a need for you to also verify, and to ensure that you already know how to, the process, right? Instead of just putting everything into the hands of the machine translation tools. I think that's where the ethical standpoint comes in. Just like, for instance, people will use ChatGPT for scholarly communication or for writing scholarly work, right? In a way, they are useful, but we also need to understand the ethical standpoint. We don't just give our work to the tools for us, but we need to do our work. We just use the tools as just like an addendum or the support, not just giving everything we need to do as scholars into the hands of these tools. So I think that's where we need to just create balance in terms of ensuring that. Yeah.
Yeah, because I feel like what also, like, coming back to what Lynn was saying, and we have a lot of the data that is being collected for, especially for low resource languages, they come from like universities or government sponsored institutions, because these commercial entities such as, you know, ChatGPT, OpenAI, DeepL, like they don't have any incentive to be collecting quality data for languages that have lower demand, right? So I think it also creates a very challenging situation between like a public institution that might have a data set and usually all these commercial tools that could take that data set and help, you know, improve access to these low resource languages. But it reminds me to some extent the model in pharmaceutical industry where a lot of government institutions does research and does that first stage, but then the profit really goes into this commercial entity. So I'm like really like worried about if we are pushing for example, collecting data, would that data later be taken and used by commercial entities and without, you know, maybe paying due respect or like giving back to those communities to some extent. And we can see with OpenAI that really they do have practices that are very unethical. And on the one hand, they offer so much, but on the other hand, they you know, do it in a way that is not done properly. So that's also like some of the question of ethics I have here. But maybe the last point that I wanted to ask you, and I really like how you touched upon that in the last slides. You were talking about the appetite for publishing in other languages, or like maybe incentivizing monolingual scholars, oftentimes I would say Anglophone monolingual scholars, to go out into the world and either publish their work in other languages or to read literature from other languages. I don't know, how much hope do we have that this is going to happen? And that's maybe like an open question for everyone, but I will start with Lynne and Philip, because I don't see that shift yet, but maybe you're seeing something else. Like I don't have much hope, like as much hope for that as I should, because I don't see those incentives really either in publishing, as you were saying, at institutions, etc.
Yes, I agree with you, Ola, that it is a gap, and I see steps towards recognition, at least recognition that it is challenging to publish in another language, recognition that, you know, maybe we do need to examine some of our practices, attitudes. I've seen a lot of attention paid to peer reviewers and simply telling them, like, stop being so rude. Stop being so critical about the language and focus on the science. So that is at least a sort of, you know, it's not getting them to publish in another language, but it's at least creating an awareness of the challenge that might lead to an openness for being, you know, an ally in the field. Another thing that I think, well, any scholar can do it, but, you know, this is something that Anglophones could do, even if they're not publishing in a multilingual way, is to try and write their material in a way that's more accessible. Sometimes we find academic writing a little bit impenetrable, you know, even for native speakers who are not subject experts. They might find it, you know, quite challenging to read in another field. And so imagine throwing on top of that, the fact that it might be your second or third or fourth language. We have some scholars who, you know, are working not even in their second language, but maybe in their third. And so to kind of, again, just sort of emphasize accessibility. like, you are publishing your research because you want people presumably to engage with it. So make it engageable, make it accessible, and you can start even in your own language. So even Anglophones can do it, to write in a way that's a little bit more reader friendly. And the bonus of that is that a reader friendly text also tends to be a translation friendly text. So I mentioned that, one of the ways to improve the output of machine translation is to improve the input, to make the input less ambiguous, more clear, more well-written, structured. And so that, again, can be a way towards kind of supporting a multilingual scholarly community by making your text more easy for other people to translate, to access through machine translation, for example. So I'm seeing steps in that sense. So I feel like it's going in the right direction. It's more kind of, maybe people are being a little more aware, a little more supportive. But yeah, I haven't seen a lot of movement in the next step of actually getting them to publish in another language.
Yeah, and I really, really love your use of the term accessibility, because I know, at least in the US context, that term is often associated with like improving accessibility in terms of like visibility, or like different like multimodal languages, but not often tied together with writing or sharing your work in another language. So it's thinking about like plain language or how the text is formatted, but I think tying it to this idea of accessibility, I think could also make a difference. So thank you for that.
Okay, thank you, Ola, for wonderful contribution and dynamization of our conversation here. I think that it's about time to open the floor for asking questions, posing comments, and furthering the discussion forward, I would say. So if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. If not, I can shoot with my questions and comments, but yeah, one can always count on Kravchik's. Yeah, bad joke, but please, Franek, and then Staszek.
Yeah, okay. Thanks very much for presentation and discussion. It's really nice to see you all, and also to read to hear about the results of the project. And I had a question about the literature review actually that you conducted, and it's a little connected with this ethical question from Ola. I was wondering because it was really interesting to see how you show that it's not necessarily the center, this machine translation do not necessarily the center English language. But I was thinking if such discussion about ethics, openness, or equality appeared in some of those papers, it was also the subject of ownership and property rights to this machine translation tools somehow touched, somehow discussed in those papers, and if it was not discussed, why do you think it is not discussed, if well, because you are the expert in the field, and that's quite interesting for me.
It's lovely to see you, Franakai. I would say that in the papers retained for our study, it was not a main topic, but it is definitely a topic that is known and discussed widely in the translation technology community. So there's definitely an awareness in that community and a concern, and also just in I would say the translation community, not specialists in technology, because it is their work that has been essentially acquired unethically. Like, they have not been paid for their work to be kind of sucked into one of those language models. So there's definitely an awareness out there. It was less evident, I think, in these papers, in part because in some ways it was almost like an unwritten thing. You could feel that it was there under the surface because there were people interested in developing their own prototype tools so that they don't have to use Google Translate, or so that they don't have to use ChatGPT. They wanted to develop their own tools. So we saw a number of prototypes, and the prototypes were using data that was already open, so things that were publicly available, and often these were tools aimed at low languages as well, less widely used, low resource languages. So even though they didn't kind of make it as a statement in their paper, I felt like it was a sort of reaction to that situation, in an unwritten sort of way. I don't know if Phillips had any other impressions from your readings of some of those papers, Phillips.
Not really. I think I go with what you said. Yeah.
Okay, so we had another question from Staszek. And so maybe I can interrupt with asking the funny question about how to feel about researching such an important topic, which has so little coverage after such a systematic review being done. So, because I think that nobody here has an impression that we are discussing something which is of no importance at all. But and at the same time, seeing that you've done so much that you've done and finding so little, and at the same time finding only evidence that supports the general dominance of English hegemony is like this. Disheartening, I would say. But I think the answer to this question is not academic in itself, but rather political. Like internationalization needs an international in terms of, communist international of many languages. But Staszek had a question.
Hello, Lynne and Phillips. Hello, everyone. I do like how your presentation seems to extend pseudopods toward much bigger questions about inequalities in global academia. But I just have one question about this shift in translation models that you have mentioned. So I'd like to ask, does the shift toward neural translation models mean that the problem with big data favoring certain languages got worse? So has the shift in itself exacerbated this problem with only the collections of data being of real use?
It's a fantastic question, and my answer is yes. The original approach to machine translation was based on linguistics, in fact. So machine translation is actually an old technology. It's been around since the 1950s, and the initial attempts to program computers to translate were based on linguistics. So they built up a very large bilingual dictionary, and they encoded grammar rules and kind of, modeled it using linguistics. Unfortunately, it wasn't a great quality in many cases because we use so many other resources when we communicate. So we have access to real world knowledge, we have access to contextual clues, pragmatic information, and those are really hard to program into a computer. So the linguistic models were not fantastic, but they were available for less widely used languages because they were, they weren't a great quality, but they were an equally bad quality for all languages, I would say, right? So it was a kind of a parody in the sense that, okay, none of them are fantastic, but they're more or less comparably bad. When we saw the switch, so before neural translation, we went from a linguistic rule-based approach into a statistical approach. So that was kind of the bridging one. And statistical models are also data-driven. So we started to see during this phase of statistical machine translation that pulling away of the languages that had more resources from the languages that had fewer resources. But the move to neural machine translation has exacerbated it because the requirement for the resources is even greater. Neural models need more resources than statistical models even needed. So the divide is growing. It's getting bigger. And, with the large language models, it's gone up again, right? The large language models are now needing in the billions of examples as compared to the millions of neural, as compared to the hundreds of thousands of statistical. So it's kind of growing and getting, bigger. And also, I would say the other side of it that we don't necessarily talk about, but that's important, is that as we need bigger resources, we need more, like they're computationally intensive. So we need better technology. We need faster hardware. We need more storage. We need bigger, more powerful computers. And this is also playing into that divide. Who has money? Americans have money. Google has money. Amazon has money. So who is developing these systems? Who's grabbing this data? Who can process it? It's not, a small startup company in Burundi who can do this, right? It's so expensive that this is also reinforcing. So the American companies are interested in processing English because that's their language. But companies in countries that speak other languages that might not be as rich, it's like who can play in this game anymore? Only people who have technical resources and linguistic resources. So it's like a double whammy. Mm-hmm.
Okay, there was a question by Lucia, but maybe it was an accident.
Yes, sorry, first of all, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, okay, perfect, because my microphone usually turns off by itself. So I read the report and I thought it was fantastic. So congratulations to everyone involved in the first place. And I really like, Christian, that you raised a political question just now, because I think the issue with low and high resource languages to feed the models that will carry out the translations exceeds the field of academic and scholarly communications, and it has to do with multilingualism in the internet in general. Like where and in what languages can we access sample texts to feed on these translation machines, and then again, I think the scientific field is a very it's a perfect example to try out these technologies, because the science and academia is based on a culture of written record, of written and published registers. And also I think that's why probably subtitles and multimodal forms of communication, posters and all that, and presentations are neglected in the research, because by the very structures of a field and how we accumulate capital in this field, we need to rely on written and published records. So I know this was not a question, but I just wanted to raise that point, and again, the report was amazing to read. So congrats again.
Thank you. Thank you. I will say that I think that the practices of using the technologies for conferences are happening, but they're not yet a subject of research. As you said, it's not the prestigious form of scholarly communication that we have kind of established. But certainly for scholars, like in the report by Tatsuya Amano and his colleagues on the costs of being a native speaker, and in some previous work by Valeria Ramirez Castañeda, they have commented on how sometimes it is a choice of scholars simply to not attend a conference because they find the spoken side of it very challenging. When you're reading something, you can take your time, you can reread, but when you're in an oral situation, you have to really be in the minute. You don't have a second chance for it. So a lot of scholars simply don't participate in conferences. And so I think there's definitely an interest in using these technologies in conferences as well, but it has not yet become the subject of research. How are they working? What do scholars need? That would make a really nice study actually for someone to do, to sort of survey scholars, find out, how these tools could help or what their experiences have been with the tools. But so far, nobody's done it. So maybe this will throw the idea out there and somebody will take that on.
Okay. Are there any other questions in the crowd? Okay, if not, I think that we will be slowly wrapping up our seminar. It is like absolutely fantastic discussion of a lot, I would say, like political, philosophical, and academic, simply academic and technical potential. And I hope that people will simply take or you will find the time and stamina to continue this research, to find the final answers and final solutions to this issue, which I wonder they will be of, in the end, of political nature, of our unequal world and unequal distribution of resources and so on. But I personally feel really amazingly inspired by your contribution and your research. So thank you very much, and thank you all for joining us. And I look forward to another amazing seminar, which will sooner or later happen, and we'll let you know. And I hope that will come and discuss with us another fantastic contributions. So bye bye.
Bye.